It is working, thank you. So thank you very much to Miles and colleagues for this opportunity. Last night we were reminded, of course, that by Laura Tubiana and colleagues that the Paris Agreement was a development agreement, and of course it was reassuring that the IPCC, consistent with the UNFCCC, is putting poverty reduction and sustainable development at the heart of this new report. So that's kind of what we're discussing here. And a reminder that going into Paris, it wasn't just the small island states that saw the imperative of retaining a target to pursue efforts to limit temperature to 1.5 degrees, but the least developed country group also expressed that very clearly to saying that the long-term goal of 2 degrees was incompatible with survival of many of those countries. So that's the sort of the context there. But of course, we're heading for at least 2.7 degrees right now, even with the INDCs. With the bottom-up agreement, we're in a very different place. So kind of sort of reality check here. I was with activist Paul Gilding, who back in 2000, this week, and back in 2010, Paul wrote a paper called The 1 Degree War Plan. So of course are we already on a war footing, or should we just be dealing with good development? And that's what we've heard from Stefan and Maarten about good development. And so 2 colleagues from our network, CDKN, are going to add a little bit to this before we throw the floor open. First of all, Virginie Masson from the Overseas Development Institute has been looking particularly at vulnerability with respect to gender and climate change. And Virginie, it'd be good to hear your perspectives on how you see this 1.5 degree thing playing out.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning, everyone. I have to say I was really impressed and grateful to Stefan's presentation as well as Maarten, because you talked about vulnerability, and I think it's too often missing in climate discussions. I fully endorse what you say about the fact that whether we reach 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, it won't change the fact that an overwhelming amount of people already have to deal with food insecurity, lack of water and sanitation, bad governance, social inequalities, and this climate prediction and uncertainty around the target shouldn't distract our attention from the root causes of vulnerabilities. So I think the attention on vulnerability and the social dimension of vulnerability is a topic that should be constantly reinforced. The second aspect that I would like to highlight is this idea of equity and justice. You might have noticed that every year at COP, there is always this push from the civil society organization bringing this gender dimension to climate change. And many of you might think, what does it have to do with climate change? Well, it has to do, and matters a lot from a research perspective, because it really helps us to understand better who contributes to climate change, who contributes to unsustainable development practice, and how people are differently affected. And I was really pleased to see how the World Bank works at the household level, because this is how we understand also better how to manage risk. And in the climate predictions, as useful as they are to help us anticipate, are not so useful when working on the adaptation dimension at the local level.
So my second CDKN colleague is Stefan Raubenheimer from South North in Cape Town. And Steph, from a perspective of your work in Africa and Latin America, where's the agenda here? Not at bigger emitting parts of the world, but impacts being felt now.
Thanks, Sam. I think there are 2 things that are sort of preoccupying me at the moment. The one hasn't come up yet, and I'm sure it will be discussed, which is, of course, the actual response to the problem, apart from the fact that 1.5 degrees is mentioned in the Paris Agreement. We, of course, have a collection of national contributions. That is the response. And this response, so far, we know, gets us about 30% towards a 2 degrees result. So we are woefully behind in terms of our current response. It almost does make the 1.5 degrees problem a very academic one. So the one thing that is preoccupying many of us, I'm sure, is what do we do to increase ambition amongst players to cross that 70% gap that we have just for the 2 degrees problem, let alone the 1.5 degrees. What activities over the next 5 years are critical to this level of ambition? And of course, we could have a long discussion about that, but that is the one preoccupying factor, and that affects the larger emitting countries, about 90 companies, a number of individuals. The responsibility is quite concentrated in regard to that particular problem. And that in itself is something that's under-researched and I think in a sense equally important for a community looking at 1.5 degrees. The other thing that preoccupies me very briefly, and this comes to the African thing, is when systems break in Africa. On the fringes of a Green Climate Fund meeting in Zambia, I went to a small Zambian village on the banks of the Zambezi, and there was a hippopotamus, many in fact. And I looked at this community, extraordinarily poor, and immediately the thought that was striking is, when does this community that sits on the edge of vulnerability, when does it break? Not when does 1.5 degrees arrive or the overshoot, but what is the breaking point? And perhaps we need to look at systems from the point of view of when a critical element in that system breaks. In this particular system, it was the ability to pump water was actually the most critical thing. And the entire community was down to a hand pump because of the problem of water flowing over the Victoria Falls and the hydro system breaking down and a lack of huge brownouts on the grid and so on and so forth. So it interests me very much to look at Africa and say, when does the system break and what are the developmental needs of these communities and the countries that they find themselves in, the larger system that they find themselves in? And how can we make that good development, which is your point, more resilient in the case of the overshoot in climate change that we're definitely going to be facing? I'm just saying those are 2 preoccupations.
Thank you. I'm going to open the floor now. Thank you very much for your comment. I think amongst the panel here, you've raised a number of extremely important issues. You flagged a number of areas that deserve a lot of attention. I'd like now to open the floor to your comments, particularly early career researcher. Please feel free to chip in here. We want to hear your voice and your thoughts at this conference. There's a lady in the back here. We'll take 3 comments. Yeah, 1, 2.
Yeah, I know we're going to cover a bit on the private sector tomorrow, talking about mitigation. But I think when you talk about good development, and you also mentioned around activities, what is the role, I guess, in the private sector? What more can be done to mobilize that? I think if you look at COP21, I was at the Business and Climate Summit last year, and there was a lot of talk from CEOs on what they could do not only on mitigation, but on adaptation. I just was wondering if you have any views on that, cross-sector partnerships, local content, you name it, what you think is working well, what else we should be doing from the business perspective.
Thank you. There's another one here, and then Deborah Roberts. No, the lady in the front, please. Just here.
Thank you. When development is discussed, there's a presumption that it is a focus on economics and macroeconomic systems. Of course, the people who are most vulnerable right now to the impacts of climate change and in the future, they live in whole spaces and they are part of a social ecosystem. I'm wondering what kind of consideration is discussed about supporting people to live in restored, healthy social ecosystems where money is not the bottom line. It's not just about livelihoods and jobs, but social ecosystems that support livelihoods, that mitigate against impact, that create more sovereignty and security for communities where they may be.
Thank you. And then Deborah Roberts here to the right.
Thanks for that input, Deborah Roberts, both a local government official and an IPCC co-chair, which is an interesting mix. I think today's inputs have been very useful, but all of these impacts and the opportunities for adaptation tie into particular geographies. And the reason we talk about human impacts is we're interested in geographies where people are at, and people are increasingly in cities. And I suppose what concerns me about these debates is that they remain urban blind. I've sat here this morning listening for someone to mention cities, because cities are where vulnerable people are, where there's high risk to economies and infrastructure, and perhaps more important for our 1.5 ambition, the ability to bend the curve at a global scale. It's our largest socioeconomic system, the world's urban areas. And yet we've got through pretty much the better part of the morning with the high-level inputs, with not one person mentioning cities. And I'd just like a response from the panel on that absence of that reflection.
Thank you. I'm going to turn over to the panel. Maybe, Stefan, do you want to kickstart us with the private sector and other thoughts you might have?
Yeah, so I try to be brief on the private sector. I mean, this is clearly a priority. When one of the things that's really important is to have people with good and decent job with good income, and that is very difficult to achieve if you don't have a private sector that's working. So there is, in terms of development, this is a priority, but there is also a contribution in terms of adaptation and mitigation, and the private development arm of the World Bank will be publishing a report in November on the role of the private sector for NDCs, trying to identify like sweet spots where we see what can happen. So clearly it's really important. I just want to flag the problem of the fantasy of the private-public partnerships and how they will save all of the infrastructure issues, just because we are saying the same thing for like 30 years, and it's pretty flat, the amount of private money that's going into infrastructure in developing countries. So we still have this gap to finance infrastructure, and right now we don't have the solution, and it's very difficult to attract private actors just because it's long-term and it's risky, and we don't have the answers. But this is a priority for us, but it's a point where we don't have a solution to implement. We really have to invent new things. On the fact that when we talk about development, we talk about the macro system, I think things have shifted immensely. I mean, if you look at what's going on at the World Bank right now, the big focus in terms of poverty is on social protection and access to labor, much more than the macro framework and the economic growth. And people have, at one point, have realized that it's very difficult to have an impact on economic growth. This is super complicated, but we had big success with cash transfers, for instance, to reduce poverty. When you're talking about local support systems and ecosystems, just want to flag the example of the productive safety net system in Ethiopia, which is a public work program which not only has been reducing poverty by providing cash to people, but also made people much more resilient because the system can be scaled up when there is a drought, and it scales up automatically so that it's quick, and it avoided in recent years some humanitarian intervention. But also the public work, what people do is to support water management and the watershed. So it's really thinking about how we can build the resilience into the system. And I'll just stop there, but just saying, when you say with the NDCs we have done 30% and 70% missing, we're trying to get the NDC implemented on the ground, and what I would say is we're 100% from there, because what is in the NDC is not implemented, and it will be super challenging to get even that on the ground. So it's even worse than your point.
Thank you. On the urban, who wants to address this? Yep, go ahead.
Just a few comments, one to the issue of the private sector and the other one to cities, to Deborah's comment. On the private sector, I somehow feel that we always say the private sector. It's like when people say Africa. And perhaps we could broadly say that there are three private sectors. There's the private sector that resolutely sticks to producing fossil-driven economic growth and lies and cheats in ways that we all know, and sticks to that agenda like glue. There's the private sector that is largely financial and speculative, and has resulted in a supreme increase of inequality in the world today, a massive extraction exercise, making it much more difficult for the poor in the world to be resilient. And then there's the private sector that is innovative, amazing, solution-orientated, and aware of what the globe requires. And somehow these three private sectors are not being dealt with in separate ways, in distinct and granular ways. I mean, for example, it's very difficult for the private sector to deal with adaptation in Africa when the discount rate applied by the finance groups is so negative that it is almost impossible to finance an adaptation project. So I think we need to start talking about the private sector in a slightly more granular way.
Thank you. On the urban, maybe we'll move to the urban question.
I was going to say, on the city side, I think there's some very interesting work being done by Bruce Hewitson in Future Climate for Africa, again, looking at when cities break, you know, when does Windhoek run out of water in Namibia, for example? What are those events, those breakages events, on the one hand? And I think, on the other hand, looking at the role of cities in the emission reduction game, I think there's still very interesting work that can be done on cities as systems, finance systems of production and consumption, in re-looking at how cities will be structured. For example, just the issue of personal and private debt in cities could be re-examined as a measure for investment in green technologies rather than an instrument of indebtedness. For example, just owning a motor car worldwide has become one of the largest debt industries, and yet really what we want is non-ownership of motor cars, but rather investment in carpool arrangements and transport. Why have we not turned this debt into an investment instrument?
Thank you. Maarten, did you want to add something on the urban? I saw you raise your finger.
Yeah, just to fully agree, and I was struggling whether to include a small islands example or a cities example, or there's a few other that I think we've missed so far. What I would particularly highlight, and I think this is relevant also for how we organize the research around the 1.5 degrees, is that when we have tried to get climate science, climate in the broader sense, climate risk information, relevant for decision makers, I've very often found that in large institutions, or also still at national planning levels, you can stay in relatively abstract worlds that don't connect to the development problems that Stefan and I were talking about. I've rarely experienced that in cities. People lose patience with that, and they are thinking very concretely about decisions that they have to make. So I think it's actually a sort of laboratory where some of these questions come together, but you also get really frank discussions that confront you with what your information needs to do. And I think that's particularly helpful as well to realize.
Thank you. Wonderful. We'll have another round of questions now. I'll take the gentleman in the front.
I just wanted to have a stab, is this on? Yeah. Have a stab at a particular adaptation to 1.5 adaptation challenge, which was mentioned earlier today, which is overshoot. Almost all the reasonable pathways to 1.5 target involve exceedance and then recovery. And that exceedance seems to me to be a potential scientific challenge for adaptation, because it asks questions about where are the particular places and systems and peoples that are resilient for a shortish period of time, several decades, to a relatively small exceedance of a target and can recover. And where are they not? You know, this transient aspect. And that seems to me to be an adaptation facet of 1.5 that ought to be considered, which perhaps Stefan would like to reply to. Thanks.
Thank you. There's the gentleman here and the lady behind you.
Stephen, regarding the question of whether we should focus on climate-related interventions or development-related interventions, shouldn't it be that currently there are some countries which are really climate hotspots, like Bangladesh and Ethiopia and so on. Others are much less vulnerable. So in the countries which are already current climate hotspots and which are likely to become even bigger climate hotspots in the future due to climate change, there obviously the choice should be on climate-related interventions. Of course, development also will be required, but in other countries probably should be vice versa.
Thank you. And if you can pass the microphone behind you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to comment that, Stefan, when you first mentioned that the difference in adaptation needs between 1.5 and 2 doesn't matter much, I think you really have to think about who you're talking to. If you're talking to small island developing states, sea level rise, coral reef impacts, makes a huge difference. This is why you've heard 1.5 to stay alive for so very many years. I think the last point you had on your slide is the most important one, the key takeaway, which is that SIDS and other vulnerable groups should be a focus of research. To me, it's quite clear that LDCs and SIDS sought a 1.5 degree limit, and that parties as an international community agreed to pursue that 1.5 degree limit. And it's really the job of the scientific community to tell us what this entails. What does this require? Recognizing that ambition does have to increase. And I think here in part is the role of the IPCC special report, which, by the way, SIDS have been calling for a 1.5 degree paper for years in the negotiating process, and it's only taken till this last year to get it. Can we not agree on the need for the IPCC special report to actually look at sea level rise and the implications for SIDS, storm surge and the implication for SIDS, water availability and the implication for SIDS, and the implications of different temperature increases for the sustainability of different SIDS, and related timeframes? And I say this because the IPCC report is meant to be useful for policymakers, and this capacity is not present in a lot of SIDS. So to be useful, can we not agree that this is a scope that should be covered by the IPCC's upcoming special report?
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the panel to be very brief here, and I'll start with the people who haven't spoken, so Sam and Virginie. And I would like to fit in another round of questions, so if you could be very brief. Sam.
So yes, having it useful in that way is, I think, something all of us sitting here would strongly support. And I think the point about geographies is really important, and how impacts will affect the ability to cope with overshoot in different ways. So the vulnerability of economies, the vulnerability of societies and households and systems to cope with an overshoot of 1.5, I think is something that could be really looked at. I was also going back to the previous question about a deliberate effort of this report to bring in the private sector, the whole issue of how this is financed. I think we know a lot more about financing climate resilient development than we did just a year or so ago. And I think really bringing private sector actors into that and learning from finance houses as part of the knowledge gathering of this report would be useful. So I've got nothing more to add. I thought those comments were brilliant in understanding the overshoot in particular.
Thank you.
To address your question, I come more from the mountain community's perspective, less on SIDS, but feels like it's the same sort of pressing issues from a climate hotspot. The point about the fact that 1.5 or 2 degrees doesn't really matter to me as a geographer is because when having a discussion with mountain communities about what are they going to do to adapt to climate impacts, well, they're already developing strategies based on the knowledge of their environment to deal with water scarcity, for instance. But when we start to have a discussion about, okay, but then in 50 years, maybe there won't be any glaciers left, how are you going to cope with water? Well, it becomes almost meaningless because they say, well, what do you want us to do? We just migrate somewhere else. And it then becomes a point of what do we do now to address unsustainable development? Why should we worry about what's going to happen in 50 years if no one is going to be left in this area?
Thank you. Very brief, Stefan, and then we'll go back to the floor.
You know, I wanted to clarify the point I was making. I'm not saying that there is no difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. I'm saying, like, even in hotspots, if I write the list of things I want to do to help these places become resilient to 2 degrees, and then I look at the list and I think, okay, if I have 1.5, what do I do differently? I find nothing. So I'm not saying that the impacts in the end will not be very different, but I'm saying that if I look at the adaptation priority, I don't think it changes very much the challenge. And just one point on Martin's question on the overshoot. So I'm very surprised because it seems that nobody's asking the question, when we get to the high temperature, do we really want to start adapting to a decreasing temperature? I mean, if we get there, for me, it's not obvious that if I was a frog trying to follow the climate change, and then when I get there, I'm told, oh, and now we will decrease by 0.5 degree. Will I like it, or will I just prefer that now that I'm adapted, we stay there? And I think it's an open question whether it's a good idea to go up and then down, or go up and stay there.
So frog, rhinos, hippopotamus. Okay, one more round. I'm going to ask you to be super brief, and then the panel, you will all get a chance to say something if everybody's super brief. So we'll start with you, and then the gentleman, you had your hand up for a while. You've spoken already.
Okay, thank you all. Well, to build resilience, we heard until 2030, basically good development is important, and then in the long run, we also need to avoid climate regimes where we can no longer manage. Well, until 2030, we have the SDGs, which try to outline the strategic directions for sustainable development. Now, we heard in this session, but also the previous session, the potential for conflict between these different objectives. I wanted to talk to Stefan and also Maarten, maybe specifically direct a question. In terms of development planning, 5-year poverty reduction strategy papers, getting the different actors that work on these different objectives, what can we do differently to minimize these trade-offs when you move from theory to practice, from planning and then to implementation?
Thank you. Then besides you, yeah.
I'd like to come back to the issue of does it make a difference to adapt to 1.5, 2 or 3? Stefan, you said that. I think it does matter whether you go for 3 or more. Actually, the 2.7 that Sam mentioned is only for a 50% probability, and then only for those things that are, say, committed without conditions by the countries. So in reality, if you take everything into account and take a 66%, you get 3 to 4 degrees. That's where we're heading. I would say that makes a difference, to adapt to 3 or 4 degrees. And shouldn't we be prepared for the worst?
Thank you. So the lady just behind.
Thank you. Just a brief question. One of the speakers, Professor Smith, I think, mentioned that there would be a need in bringing together all the different models that exist across different countries to have sort of an integrated model for natural systems processes. There is, for example, this integrated global greenhouse gas emission system that the World Meteorological Organization have. Is there any sort of system for human implications, for human impacts that would exist, or would there be a need in such a integrated system between the agencies, for example, like the WFP or the Red Cross climate or in other organizations? Would there be a need in such a system for human implications, or maybe it already exists? Thank you.
Thank you. And there's Kevin in the top. Very briefly, Kevin, please.
This is again for Stefan, really, on the 1.5 degrees C and the implications for development. I mean, I would disagree there, because when you think about 1.5 degrees C, basically we have to have nets to deliver it, assuming that they actually work. 2 degrees C, we could probably still just about deliver with deep and immediate mitigation. The problem is we have this now huge intellectual capacity that is focusing on nets, including funding. That intellectual capacity is not there to look at actual mitigation. So actually, by focusing on 1.5, we make the risks for 2, 3, and 4 much greater.
Thank you. And there was a question over there. Yes, please, the lady with the yellow shirt. And then I'll come to the panel. I'll start with you, Maarten.
Thanks. Just briefly, I wanted to flag the word maladaptation. And I wanted to ask about that because some of the conversations around focusing on 1.5 versus 2 are resulting in, okay, maybe it's not so bad. So how are we going to adapt to that? How are we going to build in that resilience? And I'm finding that, generally speaking, that's more of a challenge in developed countries than in developing countries, when often there are better systems for resilience because they've had to build that for various other factors. So how do we cope with maladaptation in this context? Thank you.
Thank you for this very rich set of questions. Obviously, you cannot answer them all, so if I can have your final thoughts and then invite you to continue discussions over lunch. Maarten.
Which one to pick? Let me start with the one on assessing impacts. So there are a couple of systems that do this. They're not systematic. Insured losses, for instance, are relatively well captured. Uninsured losses, much less captured. There are some efforts to bring some of these things together, but overall I'd say it's as abysmal as the climate data themselves, particularly in the most vulnerable places. So I would say that's definitely an area for attention.
Yeah.
Let me leave it at that point and leave the others.
Perfect. Thank you.
On the question on maladaptation, I strongly agree with you that there are many places where they've developed resilience mechanism, and I strongly believe that sometimes the best strategy is to enable those places in the developing world to develop their own practices without too much interfering, because we have a lot to learn from their experience.
I very much like Bert's idea that we should have a look at 3 degrees, and your idea that we should then model what humans will do, specifically, for example, in terms of movement.
So the utility of the 1.5 report is going to be best if it mirrors the processes that are going to happen at national level. The INDCs are only going to work if they're bedded into national level development action. And so building on Frank's passion for linking into the SDGs, I think needs to be mirrored right through the research that we do.
And maybe on how to minimize the trade-offs between the SDGs. In practice, I don't see this trade-off being thought of in strategic terms. Nobody is thinking, I will do more on SDG 3 and less on 5. I think the way it works is every time we can make progress on one of those, we're just trying to jump on it. And that's the way it's done. So I don't see this trade-off being part of the work we're doing.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your very difficult question and tackling very important issues. Before I hand the mic to Miles, let's thank the speakers again and the panel.